Okay, well, welcome everybody. Today we're going to be building upon your new knowledge of composition. Last week you had a web quest where you were searching a few sources and learning about some compositional elements, which we're going to be talking about today. We're going to define what composition is, and we're going to see some examples of how you use composition in photographs. Before we begin, I do want to highlight how important it is to have good composition in your photographs, because whenever we get to editing, if you don't have a good base in your photograph, it's going to take so many more hours, and you're basically recreating or creating a whole image on yourself. And we want to make it as easy as possible on us. So starting with a good photograph is the best way to go. And following these tricks and tips will be a huge asset to us. So let's begin. The first thing that we're going to cover is what composition is. So what composition is basically just the arrangement or the placement of the objects, your elements in your photograph, and where you place them in your picture plane. You can think of your subjects as like people, places, things, or they could be things like actual art elements like line, shapes, value, color, texture, all of that. And how you put them in your photograph, in your picture plane, is composition. So our first composition element is the rule of thirds, which rule of thirds is one of the easiest ones to learn because you can have an actual grid, a rule of thirds to show you, to compare it to. So what rule of thirds is if you can imagine having two vertical lines on an image and two horizontal lines over top of an image, where on those lines and where those lines intersect should be the main subject of your photo. They create nice balance, a satisfactory feeling to them. And some cameras, some editing apps have that capability of putting a grid over top of it so you can move things around and make sure things are either near those lines or on where those lines touch. So our first example is of a lighthouse where there's the grid over top of it. So as you can see, two vertical lines, two horizontal lines. And the lighthouse where it first intersects on that grid is right at the bottom right-hand corner. And then that whole lighthouse really just goes along that right-hand line to make for a really nice, satisfying photo. Our next photo has a bit of a grid inside of it already, where the wood planks are divided into three to already break it down. And then if we were to put a grid, as you can see from up top here, over top of this one, right where this cup is at, would intersect with our horizontal lines going from side to side as well. This next example, if I were to put a grid over top of this image, right where this chair is at would be right along this most left-hand line, and the left-hand line would meet the bottom left-hand line and intersecting about right where my mouse is at as well. Very similar to this lighthouse as well. This bottom third of the ocean is about a third of the whole picture. So rule of thirds in that way as well. And then the lighthouse would be on the most left hand in the bottom horizontal line, and same for this soccer ball. And as you can see in this image as well too, the image takes up about a third of the photograph and the background takes up about 2/3. Our next compositional element is leading lines, and leading lines can be a fun one because once you start seeing these lines, you're going to start seeing things in a whole new way and really play around with that. So leading lines, when we look at a photograph, an artwork, anything, our eye wants to have a path to follow. We want to know where to go. If there's chaos all over, we don't like that. We want easy, go from point A to point B, and an easy way to do that is with a line. And you basically as an artist have mind control of where your viewer starts and ends. You can take them on this journey throughout your artwork and control how they see it, which is really cool to think about in that perspective. So our first example right here is of the road leading back to, I believe it's Monument Valley, but there's no question where you start here in the bottom of the photograph, and then it leads you all the way to that middle section right where Monument Valley is at. It's boom, you're right there no matter what. Same in this example as well. All of these diagonal lines are leading you to this top, slightly left section, and even the handrails of the escalator, all the elements of the escalator, but even these people that are bigger and then getting smaller all lead you up to this last little point up there. But lines don't have to be just diagonal lines. You can find other types of lines like this circle spiral of a staircase just going down, and it leads you into this kind of abyss in the middle of that empty black hole. But there's no doubt about where you end up in that photograph. This next example is a spiral, but also some diagonals to lead you right into that middle of the spider web. This line, very different from that first road, comparing it, that this one is very, very windy, leading us to the top right-hand corner. Our next compositional element is framing, and just think of like a frame. You can find like something to frame, like fingers. My water bottle has this opening that you can frame with, or you can find natural frames in nature as well, which it's just using this kind of barrier to focus in and zoom in on a subject so you know exactly where to look into with that open space. So this first example is of the White House, and there's no question we're supposed to be looking at the White House because it is framed with the fence outside, and very much having the White House contrasted with that black frame just zooms your eye right in there. Same with the skateboarder, that there's this tiny little opening in between the rails of the handrail, and all you see is the skateboarder just zooming by in that open space. Instead of looking at the rest of the rails, your eye goes to that one point. Or like this landscape, which I really enjoy. I love landscapes, but having it not completed, you can't see the rest of the scape. Because it's framed off by this open window. I just really adore. I love it. I think it's really satisfying to look at. And your frame doesn't have to be completed as well too. This archway is cut off by the photograph, and it just zooms us into these people in the bottom right hand corner. The next example is of a natural frame, and if you can tell, it's not a completed whole frame as well, where we see this opening in these trees to really zoom in and focus in on the moon right there. Our next compositional element has been touched on up above, but I haven't really been focusing in on it like we have here. We're simplification, where we get rid of a bunch of distracting stuff around our main focus, and there's no question about it, our clear sense of focus should go to that main viewpoint. And a lot of the times there's a shallow depth of field, meaning like there's not a lot. Like I have a shallow depth right here. It's just myself in the wall rather than myself in a landscape that goes on forever. I'm the main focus right here because there's nothing else really to take away from me. And you can get close to the subject as well, which this first one, getting close to the colored pencils, really brings a whole new perspective, a whole new way of seeing it right there. And over on the right-hand side, the example of the wall, I mean, all we really have is the window and the dog to look at. Everything else is simplified out of the picture. All we have are those two subjects. And this one I love too because snow is really not simple. It's very complicated. We have lots of lights and mediums and darks in the background, but having that just light and those grays against the pop of color, there's no question what we're supposed to be looking at is the leaf in this photo. Or in this example, there's no other trees, nothing else around to compete for our focus. It's just that simple tree right there. This next example is a great one of a shallow depth of field, meaning we can't really tell, can't really see what's behind. All we can really see and make out is our subject right there. We can kind of figure out that there's probably grass, leaves behind it, but only thing we really can focus in on and really look at is that flower. This barn is comparative to that tree, that there's nothing else around it competing for our view. This next one, really a complicated, stormy, kind of eerie scene, and I really enjoyed that it's simplified by having the silhouette of the people as well, or the person on the platform. No question, having that just black against that really eerie sky, we focus in right there. This next example, a bit of a deeper view, where we can really see that there's buildings, there's lots of land behind it, but it's not as clear cut and it's not in focus like he is. So we know right away what we're supposed to be looking at is this gentleman. Our next compositional element is balance, and you can think of like an old-timey scale where we want to have a nice visually balanced photograph, which sometimes it can be really heavy, and if it's heavy on one side compared to the other, it creates a kind of emptiness, a void in our scene. Now, I mentioned earlier we like those odd number objects. You're going to see that in a lot of these examples next. Sometimes we have it perfectly balanced, two things, but generally if we don't, we have 3 or 5 or whatever odd number objects to help balance it. So like this first example, if I were to cut it in the middle, it's perfect on both sides, almost identical. But the next example where we have our chess set, if we just had this one on the left and nothing over here on the right, it would seem very empty and needing something. So they placed 4 little pieces over on the right side to help balance that one out. And if you notice, there's 5 right there. Odd numbers, remember that. Really nice to look at. 3 birds down here, odd numbers, where this one that's spread out, it's balanced with the 2 on the side, or if the 2 were on the side, it's balanced with the 1 spread out one down below. This one is almost perfectly balanced in the middle. There are some different features along each left and right side, like the piping on the left side is really balanced with the handrail. And sometimes you can balance it with itself, like this one is balanced with the shadow of itself in here. Now this last one is actually 2 compositional elements and vantage point. What vantage point is the angle in which your artwork is done or taken in. So we as viewers of art don't like to see a natural eye line for the viewpoint, our vantage point. We like to mix it up. One, because a camera, a painting, it really cannot capture what our eye is able to capture. We have a wide spectrum of our view, and we see it every day. We want to see something that's different. So there's 2 kinds. There's bird's eye and worm's eye. And imagine you're each of those animals to get the view. So the first one is a bird. If you were a bird flying above a city looking down, this is an example of what you would see. And this is a very deep photograph. And our next example is not so deep. It's like if you were on the second story looking down on your first story of your house. Still bird's eye, you're high up looking down, but not as high up. Or simply like your workspace. Looking down at your laptop just takes on a whole different view, a whole different perspective to what you see every day. And the next one is the worm. So this first one, you can imagine you're a worm in the grass and you look up and you see the flower. Or you're a worm looking up on the golf course and you would see a golf ball on a tee and golfer coming. Very different from if a normal human seeing it. The golfer would probably be the focus, but this one really interesting to have the golf ball and the tee be the main focus. This one's always fun. I love this kind of like monumental look of the worm's eye. Sometimes when you go to cities, you'll see tourists laying down on the sidewalk with their cameras looking up to get this monumental view of the building, just kind of going big. When I take photographs of like athletes, I like to get really low and tilt my camera upward. So they're just coming in like this big old giant, this big statue basically of pure power coming in, to really just change the viewpoint instead of them just running in at me. I make them look big and like godlike almost when you see them from this low perspective. This next one is using the ground. So there's 3 grounds to be aware of, and generally in your photographs, you want to have all 3 present to create this. It's funny because my fiance is a horrible photographer because he doesn't know the idea of grounds. He usually only has like a foreground and a background, or middle ground, background, excuse me, where we want all 3. So foreground, like in this example, is the rocks, the beach. The middle ground would be kind of the pier, the water as it's going away from us, and the background would be the sky. Having all 3 of those present makes for a really nice photograph. Or of this train track and mountain view. So our foreground would be the trains, the train track, the snow. Our middle ground would be the mountains, and our background would be the sky. Or this next example of the dog in the truck. He would be in our foreground, the ranchers would be the middle ground, and the mountains behind, and then the sky would be the background. Having all 3 of those creates for a really nice sense of space and place and satisfyingness in our photographs. Now, the next thing that I'm going to be talking about, mergers, is not a compositional element, so you don't need to do this in part of your assignment, but it's just something to be careful of when you're out taking photographs. A lot of the times these happen and we don't really notice or know that it happens, but mergers are when things overlapping each other and you can't tell which is which, or they're supposed to be separated. It can be really distracting and kind of annoying for the viewer if you can't make out what is supposed to be what. So these examples, like the horses overlapping each other, it basically looks like this horse would have 6 legs instead of 4 because you can't tell where the end of it and front of it really merges. It seems like a really odd looking horse when first looking at it. Or the cheetahs, where like 2-headed cheetah kind of randomly, when you first look at this, like what is going on? It doesn't make sense. And then you really have to take the time. Sometimes it can be interesting. Most of the time we see this as like annoying, like why is it there? Why didn't they fix it type of mentality. Like I mentioned earlier, usually you don't realize that mergers have happened until you get into the lab and you're looking at it and accidentally these things are merging. And sometimes we can fix them. Here's an example of what you can do. So this photograph of this dandelion, it's a merger because the tips of it over on the right side are cut off. We don't see all of it. And to some people, that would seem like kind of annoying that you can't see all of it. It seems kind of unfinished and a little bit sloppy. So you could Photoshop it. So you put the background in, show the tips of it. There's ways to fix it. But sometimes if you can't fix it, it's best to just go with the flow and make it look like it was intentional and you meant to do that. So zooming in and making it focus in and simplifying it, that's an option for what you could do. So while you were viewing this presentation, hopefully you were taking notes. Along on your note sheet, you need to find examples online of all the compositional rules and turn that into your assignment.